Over the course of history, there have been few debates with broader implications than the debate concerning economic inequality and its manifestation at different levels, ranging from the economic hierarchy at the international level all the way to the inequality existing at the intra-country level. As the debate on international inequality has continued to evolve, academics, politicians, and international stakeholders have continued to use the word globalization to refer to a wider range of economic and political processes that have come from an increasingly interdependent global economy. Our next speaker, Professor Joseph Joyce of the Wellesley Economics Department, has researched these questions concerning globalization's economic implications, with past research focusing in particular on financial globalization. Currently, Professor Joyce is Professor of Economics and holds the M. Margaret Ball Chair in International Relations. Professor Joyce has been involved with the Institute from its beginning, having served as the founding faculty director from 2009 to 2016. With a career focus on both teaching and research, he has taught classes in macroeconomics and the economics of globalization, and was awarded the Pinansky Prize in 2014. In the past, he has been a visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund, Harvard Center for International Affairs, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He received his BS-FS degree in International Relations from Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and an MA and PhD in Economics from Boston University. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Joyce.
Thank you, that's very kind. It is indeed a great honor, as always, to be at the Albright Institute. I'll just make one or two comments about the introduction, which was quite correct. I did indeed have the honor of being the faculty director of the Institute, but it's very important that you know that right next to me was Joanne Murray. And so it's hard for you to understand that 9 years ago, this institute was Joanne and I sitting at a table with a yellow pad of paper between us, saying, well, I don't know, what do you think we should do? And we'd go back and forth. And that literally is how the institute was created. And so I'm happy to talk more about that if we have some time in the future. But you all owe an enormous debt of gratitude at that moment. And I want you to understand that and to thank her over the next 3 weeks for doing that. The second thing I'll just add, I do have the honor of holding the M. Margaret Ball Chair in International Relations. It's just a fancy set of words. It's a little trinket the college hands out to faculty members. But M. Margaret Ball is kind of important. She was a professor of political science here at Wellesley College back in, I believe, the 40s and 50s. And among her students was Madeleine Albright. And Madeleine Albright kept her textbook from Margaret Ball, that Margaret Ball herself had written in the course that Madeleine took with Margaret Ball. And Madeleine presented me with that book with her own handwriting in the margins when I received the chair, and is one of my proudest possessions. So it's kind of like the great circle here, Margaret Ball to Madeleine Albright to Joe Joyce and the Albright Institute. And again, it's very thrilling for me to be back with you, with these guys today. So we're going to talk about populism. It's a word that's gotten a lot of currency in the last couple of years. Okay? For example, 2 years ago, when we started the presidential primaries, we had the interesting phenomenon of very different people telling us that they would be populist. Bernie Sanders said he would provide us with free college education. Donald Trump said he would go to Washington and drain the swamp and attack the special interest. And yet clearly they looked at these things in a very different way, even though they both claimed to be the populist. This is not solely a US phenomenon. If we go to Europe, on the one hand, we had Marine Le Pen on the right-hand side, head of the National Front in France, running for the presidency of France, claiming that she would help protect French people from foreigners, which would include immigration, the euro, et cetera, et cetera. On the left-hand side is Jeremy Corbyn, the current head of the Labour Party of Britain, tipped by many people to be the next prime minister whenever there is the next election. And he very much is in favor of policies that would involve privatizing, having the government take over private industries, providing more social services, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we have this phenomenon of people claiming they're populists, but when you look at what they claim to be doing, it's very different. So it leads us to a very basic question: what is a populist? So before I start giving you any definitions, which I know sounds very easy, I'm going to make it hard and ask you, what is your perception of what a populist is? So I'm going to ask some of you for your ideas. So before we get started, should we explain cold calling? So Sarah, you spoke very well yesterday. Would you explain to the class what cold calling is?
Yeah, so cold calling is something that Professor Joyce does in class, and he just basically calls out your name and does not expect you to have the right answer, but wants to hear what you think of whatever he's asking of you.
Very good. And Danny, how do we like cold calling? How do we like cold calling?
If you've done the readings beforehand, you're fine with this, but if you haven't, you might have to improvise on the spot.
But Tana, you always had done the readings, so you loved cold calling, didn't you? So really, you could see they're still friends of mine, even though they took classes with me. So clearly, I didn't traumatize them too badly. So with your permission, let me start off by asking, what is your perception of what populism is? So Alex, when you hear that word, oh, what? You think I was going to wait for someone to raise your hand? No. You listen to what Sarah just told you. No, I don't wait. I plunge in. Alex, what does that word mean to you?
My perception of populism is it's like similar to the concept of the people having power. So like a greater body of individuals sharing power instead of having like one centralized government, for example.
Okay. That's interesting. Mia, what do you think it is?
I think it also starts with the people and has a very like grassroots notion of unity and collective action.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Nia, is your perception though positive or negative when you hear that those explanations?
Negative.
Why? And that's fine. It's a fine answer. What?
I don't know. It seems kind of extreme, almost.
Okay. Same question, Kate, for you.
I think like a couple years ago I would have had a more positive connotation, but I think my definition of a populist has shifted, so I think now it might have more negative connotation.
Very good. So what I'm hearing is that there is a sense that populism is obviously based on some notion of popular sovereignty. But what that means in terms of how it plays out is a little complicated. And that over time, people have, in a sense, changed a bit their perception about where does that get us in terms of society. Those are very good answers, okay? Because it turns out that populism is complicated. So what I'd like to do is give you a definition of populism, talk to you about why populism might arise as a phenomenon in society, tell you a bit about the economic policies of populism, some of the consequences of that populism, and before I totally ruin your day, give you what I hope are some good alternatives in terms of what I'll call an intelligent populism. Okay? So let's start off with the basic question, what is populism? And I had the same questions you did and thought of it in the same ways that you guys talked about. So I did what many of you would do. I did a search and went to the search engine and write in, what is populism? And here's one web page that I found with a bunch of different answers. Any of various often anti-establishment or anti-intellectual political movements or philosophies that offer unorthodox solutions or policies and appeal to the common person. You're going to hear that phrase a lot, the common person, rather than according with traditional party or partisan ideologies. Grassroots democracy, working class activism, egalitarianism, representation or extolling of the common person, the working class, the underdog. So very much here a notion that we're talking about a certain group within society. So that's a reasonable way of thinking about it. But I want to raise with you the following question. Who exactly are these common people who we're so enamored with? Because populism, by definition, is divisive. Populism divides society into some group who are, let's call them the common people, versus they or them, or who. We'll see in a minute just how we identify with who that other group is. Okay? And it's a moralistic division. Okay? It's very much the good us versus the evil them. Why are they evil? For many reasons. They steal from us the fruits of our labor. They deprive us of a voice in terms of our ability to get political solutions. Okay? But clearly it's a sense of a war between one group within society and another. Okay? So that's the generic idea of what populism is. But it still kind of begs the question, okay, so there's these two groups. There's the common people who are good and the non-common people, we're not quite sure who they are. Well, who are they? And it turns out that there's more than one right answer to that question. So I'm going to draw upon the work for the next couple of minutes of a very, very good economist at the Kennedy School by the name of Danny Roderick. Interestingly enough, Professor Roderick comes originally from Turkey. We'll maybe have cause to talk about Turkey as we go forward in terms of some of the policies going on there right now. But he's been thinking a lot about this notion of populism and what is populism and populist policies. And he recently did a couple of papers about it that really struck me as really an interesting insight. So again, the basic question is, how do you divide society between the common people, the us, good, versus the others? And Professor Roderick suggested that there's at least two ways of demarcating society in terms of dividing people. Here's number one, based on some notion of national or cultural differences, okay? And then it gets really, in a sense, straightforward to understand. There's us domestic people, and there's them. And they are foreigners. They're different from us in a number of different ways. And right away, that gives us a very nice way of kind of saying, oh, then I can imagine dividing society, and this bin of people go into that group, and those guys can go to that group, and it's very clear what the line is between them. Okay? So it's natives versus foreigners. I could give you many examples where that might be true. Certainly, one might be 1930s Europe. And so I was looking at all sorts of photos to scan to show up for you today. And I had some wonderful ones of Benito Mussolini in Italy in the 1930s with these huge popular rallies. And clearly he was appealing to Italians to, in a sense, regain their national pride. And that explains a lot of the things that he was doing. Okay? But I couldn't help put up this picture. And if you can see it, it is once again Ms. Le Pen of France running in the presidential election of last year. And I know you can't see it well, but on the T-shirts of the people behind her, okay, is the French word for people. So again, it's very, very clear what the message is. Here's Ms. Le Pen with a group of the people. And how do we know they're the people? Because they're waving French flags. So it's very clear what's going on here, that she has a very clear notion about what exactly populism is. Populism is French people asserting French rights vis-a-vis whom? The foreigners, who might be immigrants, who might be all sorts of other people. Okay? So that's one way of thinking about populism. But it's not the only way. We can also think about dividing the population by economic class. So this is very different, isn't it? So now we're talking about saying, well, there are a group within society who are the true producers. These are the workers, the farmers. Okay? But against them are the capitalists, the financiers, the people in a sense appropriate, take away the fruits of their labor. So now it very much is a class-based division. Okay? You may be surprised to know that in the United States in the 1890s, we certainly had a very active populist movement, and it very much was based out in the farmland. And if you know the story, it was farmers feeling that Wall Street bankers were making their lives difficult. Doesn't that sound familiar? Okay, so we have a rich tradition in the United States of populism. That type of populism, no question about it. You will see it in 20th century Latin America. So the photo on the right is Juan Perón. Mr. Perón was head of Argentina for a number of years. And certainly the type of populism that he preached in Latin America was a populism based on economics. That Argentine people were those who actually did production, and they had to protect themselves against those who, in a sense, wanted to rip them off in some sense. Okay? So that's a different way, isn't it? And right away you can say, oh, so this is going in different directions in terms of who we want to favor and who we want to, in a sense, oppose or go against. Okay? So I should point out that the two things can merge, the two ways of thinking about it. And I suggest to you thinking about contemporary Venezuela. So Venezuela, starting with the former Colonel Chavez, who became head of that country, very much started with a class-based populism. No question about that was the roots of his appeal within the Venezuelan population. But over time, it morphed into also being opposed to foreign capitalists, where foreign capitalist number one, not surprisingly, was the United States. So it is possible to see a kind of combination at times of these two ways of thinking about things. So you do have your domestic enemies, but those can be aligned with the foreigners as well. So it's like a double danger that you're getting from the two sides. Okay? So I don't want to overplay the two different ways of thinking of it, but again, I simply offer it as Professor Roderick's way of thinking about how to understand why Jeremy Corbyn can call himself a populist and Marine Le Pen can call herself one, and yet they say very different things. Because to them, who are the people, who are the common people is very, very different. And once you see that, you can see, all right, so therefore you're going to preach different policies because you have different constituencies. Okay? So simply a way of thinking about populism, trying to say, all right, now I understand why all these different people are saying they're populists. They're saying different things. They're using the same term, but they're using different assumptions about it. Okay? So why? Why does populism arise? Okay? Many answers, and historians are better suited to help answer those questions than economists. But just off the top of my head, I was thinking about the end of World War I, leading a deep sense of grievance within Germany and other countries. Some sense of political division becoming exasperated over time. Social alienation, a perception of unfairness, that something's wrong with my position, and it's wrong because of them, whoever they are. Okay? And that in turn might be linked to some notion of inequality. So income inequality is a topic that I will tell you is not well studied in economics 10 years ago, and that basically has come out of virtually nowhere and has exploded. And it is now something that economists think about a lot, and we should, because it is an important topic. So what I'd like to do is take a little diversion down a side road of economics that looks at income inequality to talk to you about how we measure it, and then give you some sense of what's been happening over time. I'm very pleased I'm following Professor Chang because he told you how important mathematics was. So I'm now going to prove it by using some very basic mathematical concepts, simply some tools, and yet you'll see they're very useful for allowing us to say something about inequality and the changes in inequality over time. So there's a little bit of economics. No one's fainted yet. Happy to hear that. Okay, I promise it'll be fairly straightforward. You're all bright enough to understand it, otherwise Joanne wouldn't have let you sit in this room. So why don't we talk a little bit about how we could measure inequality. On the horizontal axis, the percent of households going from 0 on the left to 100 on the right. On the vertical axis, the percent of total income going from 0 to 100%. Okay? So that's what we're graphing. And the way that we do it is that let's imagine that we all are the society in which we want to measure the Lorenz curve. And I ask you all to come up here. And then we're going to line you up with the poorest person in the room standing right there, next to her, the next poorest, et cetera, up to the richest person right there. Okay? So that's our horizontal axis. So let's start over here with the poorest person. And she represents some amount of the population, maybe 1%. Okay? And we find out how much of total income does she receive. Now she's the poorest person, so it's not going to be very much, is it? Okay? So let's make a number up. Let's say 0.1%. So a really, really, really small slice of the pie. Okay? That's our first observation. 1% of the population receive 0.1% of the income. Next person. So now we have the second 1% slice. Okay? We ask her, how much of national income do you receive? She's a bit better off than the first person, but not that much better off. So it's not 0.1, it's 0.3. Okay? So now we know that the first 2% of the population receive how much? 0.1, 0.3, 0.4% of income. See what I'm doing? Now I keep going. And at some point, the numbers begin to shoot up because now I'm getting to the richer and richer members of society. And finally, I come down here to the end with the richest person, and she receives a big chunk of it. And now when I add in her income, I have 100%. That's the Lorenz curve. Very, very simple. Okay? Now, imagine two different polar situations. Situation number one, that when I call you up to ask you how much of income you receive, every single person gets the exact same amount. We live in a totally equal society. And it doesn't matter where you are on the line because everybody gets the same. If that was the world that you guys represented, that Lorenz curve would be a straight line that you see on the board. Because clearly every time I went up, I would go up at the exact same amount. And that would be the curve of perfect equality, the blue line that you see on the board. Okay? Now let's do the opposite. We live in a very, very diverse society. In fact, it's so stratified that the first 99% of the population gets zero income. And it's the one person at the end who receives everything. Well, what does the Lorenz curve look like then? It's a straight line that follows the horizontal axis until the very end when, whoop, all of a sudden it jumps up. So it looks almost like a right angle. Okay? Clearly unrealistic, but it gives us a sense of the two ends of the spectrum. And then every society will fit somewhere in between those two types of polar extremes. And so the red line is a hypothetical actual Lorenz curve that you would see for a particular society. Okay? Questions about what it is that we're looking at? Okay? So you can imagine that if we had the data, we could go out to the same society over time and plot the Lorenz curve and look at maybe how it changes over time. Does it get more bowed out? Does it get closer to the straight line? We could look at different countries and compare them in terms of their Lorenz curve and obviously just line them up to get a sense of which one is relatively more unequal than the others. But that's a lot of visualization and it's a little imprecise because two of us could be looking at the same graph and saying, well, I don't know, it looks kind of bowed out. And the other one says, no, it not. So that's a little imprecise. So Rebecca, would you call up the Gini coefficient? The Gini coefficient says, well, let's do the following. Let's do an actual Lorenz curve for some society, some point in term. Then look at the area represented by A, which is the distance between the straight line and the actual one that we have for the society. Take that area as a ratio of the complete area A and B underneath the perfect equality line. And if you look at it and think about what I've just said, the smaller the Gini coefficient is, then the more equal the society should be. Conversely, the larger it is, the more area it is, the more it's bowing out toward that extreme right angle example. And so then it would be more unequal. Okay? So the Gini coefficient is a way of allowing us to take the Lorenz curve data and to actually say, well, let's find an easy way of actually using it. And so we take that data, and again, we could look at countries over time and see what's going on. We can compare countries, but the Gini coefficient is simply a number that allows us to express the amount of inequality. Good. So Rebecca, let's see if we can go back to my presentation and talk about some real numbers. So before I show them to you, let me just say as a rule of thumb, usually a Gini coefficient of over 0.4 is seen as one where inequality is increasing at a rate which might cause concern. So it's a rule of thumb. There's no mathematical theorem here I'm trying to show you. It simply says that when you look across different societies, once you go above 0.4, kind of might be a red light starts to flash. Okay? So let's see if my next graph does show up. And it does. Thank you. Okay? So I pulled this off, and it shows you, okay, that Gini coefficients for different groups of countries. So let's just stop for a second and look at the data and just think about it, and I'll try to answer any questions. Emerging countries, which, by the way, I should explain what that phrase is. It's one that's used a lot. Roughly, emerging market economies are those which may have been poor in the past, but which have had a burst of growth in the last 20 years. So if I throw some examples at you, it might make it easy to understand. Think China. Think Argentina. Think Poland. Think Indonesia. Think South Africa. Okay? So again, these are not the advanced economies of Western Europe, the US, Japan, Australia. But they are countries which have had pretty impressive growth rates over the last couple of decades. So they're up there at the top. And you can see that this is obviously an average number across different places, but that number past 0.4 a while ago has been headed up towards 0.45. Okay? So there does seem to be inequality in those countries. China is a good example, where inequality has certainly grown over the last couple of decades. That certainly when you go back to the 1980s and compare current day China, it's a very different society, as I'm sure many of you know much better than I do. Okay? But now look down and notice the blue line for the United States, which has grown from about 0.32 in 1980 to about 0.4. I will tell you I'm a little suspicious of that number because I've seen higher estimates, that the US inequality is actually higher than 0.4, maybe 0.44. Okay? So I think that number, if anything, is on the low side. Notice the UK has had a similar phenomenon in the sense of rapidly growing inequality, going back to 1980 through more recently. Again, I think that number might be on the low side, that the actual UK number might be a bit higher. There are some countries below it. Notice the developed countries, okay, which are basically the advanced economies in general, have lower coefficients than the emerging. Well, how could that be true if the US and the UK are up there? And if you look down, you have the Eurozone. The Eurozone are the 19 countries in Europe that use the euro as a common currency. Okay? So we obviously are talking about Germany and France and Italy and Australia, countries like that. And those are countries that have lower inequality than the US and the UK. Okay? So that's why when we have the developed countries overall, when we grab these together, you will see an average that's lower than the emerging. But I really want you to see that within that average, there's big differences between the Eurozone countries and the United States, for example. Okay? So that's inequality. That's inequality, and that's the trend. And you can see that it's been rising across a broad range of countries since roughly 1980. It seems to be flattening out recently. Again, you want to be careful about drawing inferences. You want to have a longer time frame. But certainly there's no reason to think that we're not rising still. There's no sign in the economy. So I literally, right before I walked down here at 10:05, Googled inequality in the US now. And out popped a Washington Post headline written by Heather Long, a former Wellesley College student of the economics department who's now a reporter at the Washington Post, reporting that inequality got worse in 2017. Okay, so right from a Wellesley College alumni, I can deliver the latest news that is still rising in the United States. Okay, so that's the phenomenon I wanted to point out to you. Now, I'm going to go back to where we started. We're talking about the causes of populism, and I'm going to be the first to tell you there are many, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But as an economist, I can't help but notice this, the notion that inequality is rising. Certainly people are aware of that, and I have to raise with you the possibility that could feed into some notion of populism. Why is my income not going up as much as others? And so that might give us a basis of understanding why we see populism. And so I think it's fair to say that the appeal of Mr. Trump and his voters was very much a nationalist one. That the reason why your income has not been going up is because of trade. That we're buying all those cheap Mexican goods and US factories are closing down. It's because of migration. That immigrants are coming down and they're working for a job at a lower wage than you would. Okay? It's because American firms are relocating